Good afternoon. I'm Warwick, Executive Director of Society of Fellows, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this SOF Digital Discussion. I hope you and your loved ones are healthy and safe, and I want to thank you for being part of the Society of Fellows. Now, something about 2020 seems to have brought many long-standing and deep systemic issues to the forefront. Among those are the mechanics of our particular democratic republic, including how we vote, as many states are now experimenting with open primaries and ranked choice voting, the fairness and utility of the Electoral College as it produces results increasingly distant from the popular vote, and the structure of the Supreme Court as partisanship further degrades its stature, provoking calls for term limits and other reforms. There is so much to discuss and analyze, and we are fortunate to have such a distinguished panel to help us make sense of it. Lawrence Lessig is the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at Harvard Law School. He's won numerous awards for his groundbreaking legal analysis, and his books include They Don't Represent Us, Fidelity and Constraint, How the Supreme Court Has Read the American Constitution, America Compromised, and Republic Lost, How Money Corrupts Congress and a Plan to Stop It. Michele Moody-Adams is Joseph Straus Professor of Political Philosophy and Legal Theory at Columbia University. She's published widely, and her next book, due next year, is entitled Making Space for Justice: Social Movements, Collective Imagination, and Political Hope. She is also working on a project entitled Renewing Democracy, as well as a book on the thought of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Yascha Mounk is an associate professor at Johns Hopkins University, a contributing editor at The Atlantic, and the founder and editor-in-chief of Persuasion, a new online platform devoted to uphold free thinking. His latest book is titled The People versus Democracy: Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. And today's discussion will be moderated by Lulu Garcia-Navarro, who is the host of NPR's Weekend Edition Sunday and co-host of NPR's Morning News podcast, Up First. She has served as an NPR correspondent based in Brazil, Israel, Mexico, and Iraq, and she's won numerous awards for her work covering the Arab Spring, including a George Foster Peabody Award and an Edward R. Murrow Award. And as with all of our SOF digital discussions, our panelists will be glad to answer your questions after the initial discussion, and you can submit your questions anytime by simply clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and typing them in. And if you encounter any problems at all during the event, please email the SOF hotline and our team will be glad to assist you. So our panelists will be in conversation now for the first 45 minutes, and then I will pose your questions to them for the rest of the event. And now it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Lulu Garcia-Navarro. Lulu?
Thank you so much, and welcome everybody to what I know will be an engaging and interesting evening, because ideas to improve our democracy, I think we can all agree, is something that we are very much in need of at the moment. You don't have to look very closely at the news to know that there are many, many things requiring our attention now, but it is a general topic. So what I'm going to ask, first of all, is each of our panelists to give us one thing that they would like, that they think is the most important thing to address at this moment, that is really crippling this great democratic experiment here in the United States. I'm going to start with Lawrence Lessig.
Well, one is a very small number. And,
yes,
you know, we recognize that there are many ways in which the institutions of our democracy are deeply unrepresentative. But the one thing I'd point to is not really directly tied to those institutions. It's the infrastructure of media or information that we discover and become committed to ideas within. Because we now live in a context where the business model of that infrastructure is to turn us into crazy people. They profit the more they can make us polarized tribal members of our own cliques and less able to engage or understand people on the other side. And this is new. It's a transformation that's been enabled by big data and AI algorithms that have a capacity to feed us what we want and thereby build on a psychological reality of humans, which is that we want to be confirmed in our own beliefs. So they're not conspiring. This is not Kim Jong-un's decision to destroy American democracy. It's a byproduct of the incentives that media infrastructure now has. And my fear is that if we can't address this problem, we're not going to have something to play with in the context of democracy.
Lots to follow up there. This is my wheelhouse, and I'm passionately interested in this subject. And I want to press you on a couple of things, but I'm going to give the floor over to Michele Moody-Adams to give your diagnosis.
So the one thing I would want to focus on most is the need to open space for creating new kinds of collaborations and cooperations in unexpected places and across boundaries that we think are fixed. This means opening up new forums, whether in the media, with religious leaders, in the academy, in elementary schools, for consensus and agreement amongst people who don't start out thinking they have anything in common. It might be that you want to get people in urban areas who may be having that work disappear, and may have schools that are badly run and not being invested in. Talking to people in Appalachia, in West Virginia, in the Rust Belt in Ohio, what do they have in common? How might they interact and collaborate in ways that could enrich the country? I'll actually give even another example. We talk about expertise as something that is, possessed only by certain kinds of people who are well educated and who've got certain kinds of experience. Sometimes expertise isn't able to do its best for a complicated society like ours when the experts don't actually know what the problems they ought to be solving are. John Dewey actually talked about the extent to which, you can bring an expert in to make you a better pair of shoes, but if he doesn't know where the shoes pinch, it's not going to do much good. So that unexpected collaborations and cooperation seem to me something as a society we've got to start encouraging.
I sense a theme here, which I like already, which is about the divisions that we're all facing here now and how to surmount them. So Yascha Mounk, over to you.
I'm going to just to make it easy, I'm going to stick with a theme. I mean, there's a lot of structural drivers of a crisis of democracy, including stagnation of living standards for ordinary citizens, including, thankfully, a more racially inclusive set of democracies, a more heterogeneous set of democracies outside of the United States than they used to be earlier. And of course, as Larry was saying, the rise of the internet and social media and the kind of incentives all of that provides. The problem is that a lot of those things are difficult to tackle because they're such deep problems. And it doesn't look very likely that we're going to have decisive political actions for the next 2 or 4 years because we don't have unified control of Congress. And so I think, let's focus for a moment on something that perhaps is in some ways smaller that we can do something about. And along the lines of what Michele was saying, I think that we're in this real temptation of saying we can't actually collaborate with our fellow citizens, and perhaps we shouldn't even need or want to, that perhaps our fellow citizens aren't even legitimate interlocutors. You have a version of that very strongly on the political right, which leads to a panic about what happens when America becomes majority-minority, which leads to all kinds of gerrymandering and voter suppression. You also have a version of that on the left, I have to say, among sort of people I tend to hang out with and feel more comfortable with sometimes, who basically say, hey, we have this rising demographic majority. The kinds of people who vote for the Democratic Party keep growing in numbers. The other people keep shrinking in numbers. So we don't have to persuade anybody. All those people who vote for Donald Trump, we just write them off. Who cares about them? Let's wait till they die off and then we inherit the country. I think one of the strange but really positive pieces of news about this election in 2020 has been to give the lie to this idea of a rising demographic majority. It's quite clear now that Republicans can successfully play among non-white voters, and that's a very smart strategy for them to pursue. And it's quite clear that Democrats can't simply rely on the idea that as there are greater numbers of Latinos and Asian Americans and African Americans, that's going to deliver them victory. And I think that's a good thing, and we should all model that by actually trying to recognize that our fellow citizens are decent people, thinking in their own ways about politics. And even if we sometimes strongly disagree with them, and I personally strongly disagree with Mr. Trump and I think that people who voted for him made a mistake, I can still respect them and argue with them as my compatriots.
All right. So we have a theme here, which is that we require consensus. Every democracy requires some kind of consensus, some idea that you are operating with a similar set of facts. But we do find ourselves after this election where there are people who are not operating in the same fact universes. They are not simply seeing the same reality. And that's being echoed in completely different media environments, like Lawrence Lessig discussed. And there is a huge crisis of trust that we are facing in everything, in institutions. I had my aunt sent me an email today, and it was all about full of vaccine misinformation. And, we are seeing an inundation of so much misinformation. So my question is, with this idea that, yes, we understand that people are of good faith, that we should reach across and find expertise and lived experience and bring people together. How do you do that in this environment where people are so incredibly polarized, where in fact, Yascha Mounk, you say, yes, we should look to the other side and we should embrace our fellow man, when on both sides, I have heard this, there is contempt, there is fear, there is rage. I'm going to start with Michele, then Lawrence, then Yascha.
Interestingly, I think here's a place where it's not so much about media and truth, but it's about the role that art might play. Art, literature, films. I'm going to say actually even documentaries, but art may be in the world where we don't believe facts and we don't believe the video that's supposed to show you the true event. It may be that there's going to be a role for the arts that we'd stopped realizing the importance of, and all kinds of things: visual arts, drama, theater, literature, music. This will be the place where commonality, I think, is likely to be built even before we can restore trust in things like what the media tells us or what science tells us. Doesn't mean these other things don't matter. But I think the arts, think about the times in the past during the Depression, for instance, and during the so-called war on poverty, when even as we were investing in people's kind of material, physical well-being, we also as a society understood the importance of investing in the arts and even investing in letting people do things that not everybody will agree with, but encouraging the flourishing of arts. I think that's going to be critical here.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we should think about something called a slow democracy movement. And what the slow democracy movement, building up, reflecting the slow food movement says is we should understand where people do politics well. What's the context in which they do politics well? And where do they do politics poorly? So we know they do politics poorly on Facebook and Twitter, these environments that are designed to rile us up and get us angry and turn us into tribal opponents.
I would even say Zoom.
And maybe, we don't know yet. But we do politics well, I agree, in art, in long form narrative, in podcasts, in contexts where we as humans can hear other humans and understand the complexity of how they think and feel and their emotions and confront that in a very human way. And I just think that what we've seen is the migration of politics into contexts that are just not fit for human thought. I mean, they play on our weaknesses. They hijack our mind and turn us into crazy people when we're perfectly capable of understanding the subtle differences and fundamental differences among each other. We've been doing that for hundreds of years in democratic traditions. We just don't do it well when we're allowed to live in our echo chambers, reinforced in our views of what the world is by an infrastructure and business model, frankly, that profits from doing exactly that.
I would say this. The infrastructure and the profit structure of social media is true. It tends to reward, for not to put another word on it, radicalization, right? The more extreme your emotions, the more engaged you are, the more it leads you to other content that sort of reinforces that worldview. But I would like to say that this puts perhaps too much pressure on the individual. Are we not seeing at this point something that is different, in which a body politic, a party, a president, a media organization, a media ecosystem has decided to go in and really look at misinforming the population as a political strategy. Does that not leave people not believing that they can trust anyone or anything?
These are not unrelated, right? It's because of the infrastructure, the structure of it is that it is right now. The fact that there are no effective editors, there's no effective control, that there's such a high return to turning people into extremists, that this becomes a business model. The political model. This becomes a model for politics. That's what's so terrifying about this. Donald Trump was inept in the way he executed the authoritarian policies, which he was obviously trying to pursue. But he's shown people a way. He's shown us that, the 4-minute mile has been broken. And now we're going to see lots of people trying to do it even better. And the point is, this environment enables it. And until we can think about how to modify that, I fear that it will just feed the next round even more fiercely.
Yascha Mounk?
Well, a couple of thoughts. I think that we should do all kinds of things to modify the environment. And I think in the long run, it may be that people just become so sick of the vitriol on platforms like Twitter that those platforms actually start to have an incentive to change how they operate. I'm a big fan of Reddit's upvote system, which I think surfaces more consensual content than Twitter, where any engagement makes you look at something. So the more controversial something is, the more it's going to be seen. I also think that a lot of this is about institutional leaders recognizing that the loudest voices on Twitter are not, in fact, the voices of the average American or of their stakeholders, and that they shouldn't be intimidated by whatever people are saying on Twitter and make decisions in their own right. I think, in the past, editors had a sense that letters to the editor are not representative of the average reader. I think that wisdom has gone out of the window a little bit with editors being obsessed with Twitter and what's going on there. That's to the detriment of institutions that are eventually going to lose audience towards institutions that have figured out how to avoid those incentives. So all of that is good. I want to say two other things. The first is, let's be very, very careful about championing censorship, because I think there's a lot of sloppy thinking and a lot of easy acceptance of the idea of censorship at the moment. Journalists are cheering on for censorship, and they haven't thought through the basic argument that why we've always been careful about censorship. It's not that there aren't some things that people say that are absolutely terrible and worthless, and I'd be happy if those weren't in the public sphere. Of course those things exist, lots of them. It's that I don't trust any political institution or any random room full of people in Silicon Valley to make a decision for me as to what I can say and hear and what I can't say and hear. And it's striking to me sometimes that people who think that all the worst people are in power in this country also assume that whoever is going to be in charge of censoring is always going to be on the side of the good. I find that very, very naive and short-sighted. So, the other thing I want to say is sort of how we get around that, how we have a better engagement with people. And the original question, Lulu, I think, was about, the aunt with the vaccine misinformation and so on. Look, we want to communicate very clearly. We want to be very forceful about the safety of a vaccine, for example, which put me first in line to take it. I would love to be the first to take it. But we should also be honest about our failings, which drive some of that mistrust. When you look just at the pandemic, the New York Times mocked people in Silicon Valley for taking the virus seriously in February. You can go back to the New York Times article saying, ha, 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 these famous people in Silicon Valley who tell people they're not going to shake hands, what xenophobic idiots they are. You can see the many months of public health officials telling people not to wear masks out of some misguided sense of, trying to ration masks for people who needed them. But those were not economists, and it was not honest, right? So I think if sometimes we say, hey, look, I get why you mistrust us. I get why you have these doubts. Let's have an argument anyway. Let's explain why you can actually rely on this, but we're not going to sit in judgment of you for that mistrust. That might be a more effective way of communicating.
Michele.
Yascha, I think your point is really well taken, but there is a framing of this that I think has to be really attended to. And that's that people trust you, even when you make mistakes, if you're honest and open about them, if you're transparent about the places where your knowledge is limited. If people had started out with the pandemic saying the learning curve is very steep, there's a lot we don't know, And we may be telling you things as we go that we may need to revise. If that had been said, I think there might be a lot less mistrust. I mean, I even am somebody myself given to trust. And for a while, especially around the masks, I thought, look, if people wear masks in a surgical setting, why isn't it good for me to wear a mask, either to protect others or myself? And I think humility, transparency, accountability when you make mistakes go towards addressing, Yascha, just the worry about people not trusting, and how to undo that lack of trust.
I agree 100%. The classroom, I love the moment when a student asks me a question to which I don't know the answer. Because if we tell them, hey, I don't know, you can feel the trust in the room growing. Oh, so when you do say something you do know, and you'll tell me honestly when you don't know, right? If we were more honest when we've made mistakes, I think in exactly the way Michele outlined, it would actually make it easier for people to trust us rather than say, hey, trust the health officials, trust the health officials. If you don't, you're a bad person and we never got anything wrong. That's not a convincing story.
Well, I think that's not a, I think that's, go on, sorry, go on, Lawrence.
Yeah, so I want to agree with the trust point, but I want to go back to this quote censorship point. I just think it simplifies the story to frame every time we're trying to control access as censorship. What if we called it editing? Are you against editing? I mean, and so when a platform like Facebook or Twitter decides certain content will not be on its platform, is that censorship or editing? The New York Times edits stuff all the time. I send them every single day an article. That's not true, but it feels that way. But I send them something all the time. All the time they say no. Is that censorship? Are they censoring me or are they editing me? And the point is, we've got to think about the world where there are no editors anymore, because that's basically the platform. And if every time somebody talks about how do we make sure that in the world where there are no editors and we know the incentives support spreading false information that is inflammatory more than spreading true information that's actually helping, what is the response to that? And I don't think this response can simply be to say, well, we shouldn't be censoring because I can't trust the censors. I mean, I get it. I'm against censorship too, but I'm also against the world where 77% of Republicans believe that this election was stolen. I mean, that is an astonishing fact. And there's no censorship that produced that fact. And the question is, what do we do in a world where we know that those facts will be generated by interested people all the time, and there won't be, troubling, no doubt, but there won't be people standing between those facts and the way in which they have an effect on the world.
Let me just jump in for a second, and I do want to speak to Yascha Mounk's point. This idea of standing up in front of a classroom and admitting that you don't know things, I think works very well in a classroom. My question, I think, speaks more to Lawrence Lessig's point, which is what happens when you do that and that's weaponized, which is we live in an ecosystem now where any misstep, any change in a story, or if, science is obviously something where we understand more as time goes on. That is why there is scientific investigation, but that is often a hard story to tell people. And so my question is, in this environment where everything is weaponized, then how do you get to that place where you can actually have expertise be trusted?
I have a thought, and it builds on Yascha's point. You have to be trusting of the audience or of your students in the classroom as much as you want them to trust you. And of course, some people are going to try to weaponize the admission of fallibility, I'll say. But you cannot assume that you can't trust some people. Most people want to believe. I genuinely think that. Most people don't want to go around suspicious with delusions, so their lives are just full of anxiety. And if they see just one kind of sign on the other side, that you admit your fallibility, you're an expert, but you don't know everything, you might need to look at people who are just ordinary people to find out what they could do to enrich your understanding of an important social problem, but you show that you are human. I think that starts to break down the barriers that divide people. There will still be bad people who try to weaponize your expression of fallibility, but I don't see that there's any other way to genuinely build trust, slowly but surely, unless we all start admitting with humility and, as I said, accountability, that we make mistakes, and for all that we, as experts, are capable of doing good things, we sometimes get it wrong. I think they'll trust us more.
Well, I want to know the context in which that's true. I mean, I agree with Yascha in the context of a classroom. I've never made a mistake in a classroom, so I don't know what it's like. But, I understand conceptually it would be a good thing to admit a mistake. But I agree with Lulu that in the context of, public discourse right now, any sign of weakness is death. I mean, but I'm just saying if you were advising, for example, think about Kavanaugh's hearings. Most of us looked at what Kavanaugh did when he was criticized and thought, oh my gosh, that is completely the wrong thing to be doing now. What you ought to be doing is acknowledging it's a long time, blah, blah, blah. But in fact, what Kavanaugh was doing was exactly what the data shows was the right thing for him to do in order to protect his opportunity to become on the Supreme Court. And we know this because of the heavy studies of what happened in the Clarence Thomas hearings. When Clarence Thomas did the same thing, when he acted, he did this whole digital lynching thing. The reaction of people, I think I share your intuition, Michele. I think the reaction of people like us was, this is not the right thing to do. But strategically, it turns out it was the right thing to do. Because when he does that, what he does is he solidifies the base. And in the context where we are not trying to systematically reach across, but instead build from the base, this turns out to be the better thing to do. The question is how to change that context into the context of something that feels more like a classroom. And that, I don't think you can just postulate, imagine.
So first of all, you may not have made a mistake ever in the classroom, Larry, but perhaps you just did now, because I think as a social scientific experiment, this is pretty weak. I mean, my prior is that in an incredibly polarized environment like the United States Senate and a confirmation for Supreme Court justice, the prior needs to be that all the Republicans were going to vote for Kavanaugh, whatever strategy he chose. I think if you get, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I'm so contrite, they would have voted for him too, I think, right? So it's not clear to me that you can sort of show which way around this works and which way around this doesn't work. The second point I want to make is, look, I think the mistake is trying to transform politics into a classroom. Politics is never going to be a classroom. But even so, you can build trust if you're honest about who you are and what your occasional failings are too. I see this all of the time when and journalists, by the way, are often guilty of this, when we don't want to report on certain things because it's inconvenient and uncomfortable because people might draw the wrong conclusion of that. Let's not talk about
journalists never make mistakes either. Just
there we are. None of us do. Let's not talk about the crime in the autonomous zone in Seattle because people might take the wrong conclusions of it. I see it in Germany. Let's not talk too much about the crime that was committed by some refugees because it'll give water to the mills to the far right extremists. And the truth of it is that people are going to know about it anyway. Clearly and openly. And say, hey, let's put it in context. Yes, of course, there's some crime from refugees, but our cities are still safe and it's a small number of cases. But of course, when there's a shocking murder, we'll report on it. That's much more likely to actually build trust when it's sort of clever by half. But let's not talk about it as many people will know. I just want to get back, I'm sorry, to the question about the internet, because I do think it's really important. Look, I'm in favor of editing. I invite all of the wonderful members of this society to go and check out Persuasion, www.persuasion.community. We edit, we decide what to run. We do take a lot of work in editing what appears and what doesn't. But Larry, you're very fond of calling things public utilities and of thinking about how a public utility should function. Well, Facebook and the other social media outlets are not like a newspaper that I choose to read or choose to subscribe to. They are, I think, more akin to a mall in the past. And there's a lot of good jurisprudence about how everybody should be able to use those as public spaces, to have political speech there, because that is now the public sphere. So I don't want somebody in Silicon Valley deciding what kind of classroom Facebook should turn into and who gets edited and who doesn't, because I think that's very different from saying I'm going to produce a newspaper that's edited.
I'm going to interject here as a member of the media. My concern is this. I'm going to speak to what Yascha Mounk says, and then I want to bring in Michele, which is you call for sort of openness and acknowledgement when people make mistakes. That was the pitch that the media, the mainstream media, thought that they were making in this era, that we have editors, we have fact checkers, we are actually a reliable source in a moment where you don't know what's happening. This is a place where you can get vetted information. And what we have seen, in fact, is that that has not played out quite in that way. There are many reasons for that, but this idea of it again comes back to this idea of institutional trust, of which the media and other institutions are also part. So my question goes to Michele. When you listen to two different points of this, and I do want to bring up this idea of censorship because I think it's an important one. How do we discuss speech? What is acceptable speech? In Europe, they have very different ideas about what that is. What can be broadcast, when it can be broadcast, what is hate speech, what is not. There are very clear lines in other countries about what that is. In this country, only very few things are deemed unacceptable speech. And so I also would like to bring it into the context of a moment of racial justice, where, what is deemed unacceptable speech in the past, now we understand to be speech that was speaking to an entire segment of society that didn't have a voice. So where do you fall on this?
Yeah, you asked about 5 or 6 questions all at once, but I'll actually take up the racial issue. I think I can make a broader point on the basis of it. We need people to be honest and acknowledge the truth of an existence of racism, some of it quite deeply systemic. But we also need a world in which, and this is what I'll get back to, the idea of disarming the standard ways that things go. We need a world in which we can open up the possibility of people being redeemed in some sense, not necessarily morally, in which we can find ways to reconcile with people with whom we disagree. And the only way, I'm thinking about people like Martin Luther King and even Nelson Mandela in 1995, when the World Cup, the South African rugby team won the World Cup. He went out on the field and shook hands with the white head of this team. The two of them planned it in a way that said, we want to start anew. We want to basically disarm people's preconceptions about the way things have to go. I think that's the only way racial justice will ever come about. I think it's the only way that will break through these barriers around people acting on resentment and fear and being in internet, social media bubbles. Somebody has to have the courage of a Mandela or Francois whatever his name's Pinar, who was the head of the rugby team, or a Martin Luther King, to say we cannot keep going the way, or a Gandhi, we can't keep going on the way. We have to disarm people with ways of arguing, with ways of living, with ways of disagreeing with others that don't look just like the way things have gone. It may mean somebody's going to be a martyr to the new way of doing it. I understand that, but we need somebody of courage. We need Joe Biden to sit down with somebody from the Republican Party, somebody who might, like a Romney or a Susan Collins, and they need to have a public conversation in which all the resentments, all the fears get aired, and people discover that there is a way to have a conversation like that in which you can be humble when you disagree. We can put all the arguments out there, and then you can ask, how might we move forward in something we care about, which is keeping the country on an even keel. That's my sort of sermon for the day. It's the disarming gestures.
Michele, did this summer of racial protest make you more optimistic that was the direction in which this country was headed, or not?
In ways I didn't anticipate. I'm probably like a lot of people that on May 29th, it was the depths of despair to see the murder of George Floyd. And then as the weeks progressed, to see people of all colors marching together. I saw Amish families standing by the side of the road. Probably they're not going to go join Black Lives Matter, but they had a sign that said, Black Lives Matter. Amish people who actually don't typically get involved in political life. So yes, I did find that it was in fact the ways in which the kind of cross-racial, multiracial, even cross-class interactions on the streets, really, I found it disarming. It shocked me. I was despairing, and it was that disarming willingness to move for people to try to collaborate across races, across class, that I did not expect. I thought it would be another Ferguson. And globally, we saw people willing to make this stand. That's what we need to build on in America, is the unexpected collaboration and the leaving room for people to do things differently.
So I want the world to be, as Michele, you're describing it. I want the world to be one where Joe Biden can act graciously and generously, and it have some effect. But what's striking about all the examples, except the Black Lives Matter example, and I want to talk about that in a second, all the examples you were talking about were examples that happened in what Marcus Pryor has called the broadcast democracy stage of modern society, where we're all watching the same show, where there's 80% of the public exposed to 3 television networks that are basically delivering essentially the same message. And there's no strategy of one network playing off against the other to kind of undermine or discredit. And in that world of this broadcast democracy, I think your strategy is exactly the right strategy. I think it has an opportunity to work because people will see both sides, and they'll see how they engage. But in the modern architecture of media, that strategy backfires. And I think the Black Lives Matter example is a great one. You're right. Immediately after the murder of George Floyd, and the 7% of America shows up to protest this extraordinary event, there's no way that that fact could be suppressed. And so it was not suppressed. I mean, everybody saw that, from Amish to whites to people in South Dakota to whatever, everybody was out there saying enough is enough. 400 years of this is enough. But then that resolve was slowly chipped away on the right-wing media, as the media frames the story of Black Lives Matter not as about empathy and understanding for 400 years of oppression, but as the desire to dismantle the police and to make it so nobody can call anybody for any support, or all of the ways in which the story of racial justice gets re-rendered as a story to divide us. And the point is that profits them. And so when we pitch the idea that we can pretend we live in a world where just acting generously and graciously will have its effect, I fear we actually live in a world where the opportunity for that has been taken away by an infrastructure of media that will just destroy it when you are generous in this way, which brings us back to Lulu's original point. Isn't any moment of acknowledging weakness death? Because that will be exploited by the other side.
I think we should be a little bit careful, and you should all be very careful about
By the way, that was a question, not a statement.
About taking strategic advice about democracy and elections with respect to a Columbia professor or a Harvard professor or a Johns Hopkins professor. But I'm a little bit skeptical about Larry's wisdom here. First of all, just on a minor point, I mean, if you think that increasingly the Black Lives Matter movement was transformed from an incredibly inclusive, powerful statement that a huge number of Americans shared to one that seemingly called for police departments to be dismantled, that has as much to do with the New York Times op-ed page that ran one op-ed after the other celebrating the idea of defund the police, even though it was unpopular in African-American communities, as it does with Fox News or any bad actors on the right. So let's look in the mirror for a little bit. But the broader point I want to make is, when have candidates, and I know that not everybody who's listening to this is going to share my political preferences, but when have candidates who I hope to win won? When have Democrats won high office? Let's look at the last 2 winning presidential candidates. It was Barack Obama. I'm just listening to his memoir and him talking about writing the famous speech of the 2004 Democratic Convention and how it was different from a lot of the cynicism that Democratic politicians had before him, and how many people thought that this idea that we have more in common than what divides us was naive. Perhaps in some ways it was substantively, but as a electoral strategy, Obama did pretty well. Well, what about this election? Every smart commentator thought Joe Biden did not understand this political moment. You thought he didn't understand this political moment, Larry. That the people who had understood this were people who wanted to take the fight to Donald Trump, to match anger with anger, right? And it turns out that the least online candidate, the candidate least willing to engage in mutual polarization, most willing to go the extra mile to show compassion for political opponents, even if he disagrees with them, won the Democratic primary and managed to defeat one of the rare times, an incumbent who was not a third-term incumbent, but a first-term incumbent. One of the few cases in which a Democratic opponent managed to beat an authoritarian populist after the first term in office anywhere in the world. So I think when you look at the last 15, 20 years of American politics, it's not clear to me that matching anger with anger is such a smart electoral strategy and that idealism is such a bad electoral strategy.
The question is a governing strategy. I mean, I agree, Obama did a great job getting elected twice. But after the first 2 years, when he lost his majorities, that was the end of the governing strategy. Everything he did from then on was just basically exploiting the power of the executive branch, a power which we should fear, because when it turns over into other hands, it becomes a power of tyranny. And that was because the politics of division turned out to be extremely effective and powerful. Mitch McConnell, I think the Dark Lord of Washington, D.C., was extremely successful in leveraging every single partisan opportunity into the defeat of Barack Obama. So, Barack was exactly who you guys are saying we should have. And again, I wish we had a politics where Barack type moves worked. But, tell me how it worked beyond, just being able to get himself elected in a context where, it's not, election isn't governance. Governance is governance. And
and governance is not strong arming people. We've been through 4 years of that already. We need a new vision. Maybe it's drawing a little bit on the past. I liked Obama. I don't think he was the greatest president we ever had. We need something different from the strategies we've lived with for 4 years. I do not believe democracy will survive if we try and piggyback, even just for strategy to win elections, certainly not for government, if we try to piggyback on the kind of methods and tools of the last 4 years. We've got to shift gears. We have to. And some of that, I'll say, I think this is another positive suggestion. Some of this is going to come from local level politics. I'm not saying localism, so to speak, is the solution to all our problems in the democracy, but it may be that some things cannot be resolved at the national level, that we have to depend upon the creativity and the kind of collaborative spirit of people in small communities. They know what it takes to live or die where they are. They know if the water's not clean, or if the streets aren't lit, or the garbage isn't picked up. And we may have to start small at the local level and find ways to reshape political engagement at the local level and then build it up. I don't think it's going to work standing in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and saying, let's do it differently.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I want to insist that it's not just the politics we have to rebuild. It's the context within which democracy happens that we have to rebuild.
I agree.
Because, we can have an argument about the strategy given the media architecture. And I'm not talking about what I want. I'm just talking about what seems to have worked. But, we're not talking about, we can't win. We can't do democracy in this infrastructure. What we need is to change it so that we can begin to have a democracy that's edifying and uniting and progressive, not in the political left-right progressive sense, but just in a sense where we address problems and solve them and move on to the next one. And what I'm trying to emphasize is that the place we find ourselves, not the people, the place, the context in the media infrastructure has it as its model to make it impossible for us to succeed in this. And we got to think creatively about how to fix this if we're ever going to find a way to get to the politics that I think all of us, in some sense, are aspiring for.
We're going to go shortly to take questions from the audience, but Yascha, do you have something to say?
I look forward to hearing from the audience.
Okay, all right. I think then we are going to move to that section to hear what the audience has questions for our panelists.
Terrific. They do indeed. It's been a terrific discussion so far. I do want to remind everyone who's watching that you can still submit questions by just clicking on that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and typing the question in. I'll try to get to them all, but we certainly have a queue in the works right now. The first one is from Peter Rigby. He asks, one of the tenets of democracy, one has to accept that losing elections is inherent in the system. That no longer seems to be the case today. Everything I've heard today is well and good, but it seems that a radicalization has gone beyond the fringe elements of society, both left and right, and has moved mainstream. What do we do in the short term during the next administration that facilitates this current presidential transition and a workable model for politics?
I think everyone should take a stab at that one, just briefly, because I think it's really important. Yascha, we'll start with you, then Michele, then Lawrence.
Well, I think this goes back to a lot of the things we've been discussing for the last 45 minutes, which is that people stop being willing to accept the outcome of elections if they are so scared of the other side, that they no longer think that they're legitimate, that they no longer think that they're decent people. This was the power of the moment, which has been much remarked upon, of John McCain in the last days of the 2008 campaign, saying to a questioner at a town hall who said, "I'm scared of Barack Obama, I'm scared about what he'll do to the country." And McCain saying, "Look, I have many agreements with Barack Obama. I think I'd be a better president. You should vote for me. But, he's an honorable man, and he should not be scared of what will happen if he becomes president." It'll be very, very difficult to get back to that. And that's a great shame. I mean, what is currently happening is absolutely outrageous. It is the most incompetent coup attempt since Woody Allen's Bananas, but it is nevertheless a coup attempt. And that should shock all of us. Now, I also want to say that, in one way or another, a large fraction of Americans have thought of elections as illegitimate for over 20 years. Democrats thought that George W. Bush was an illegitimate president because of the situation in Florida. Republicans, with less justification, thought that Barack Obama was an illegitimate president because he was supposedly born in Kenya. I have to say that retrospectively in 2016, there clearly was Russian interference in the election of some form. There clearly was some willingness to collaborate that was morally shameful. But there was a lot of sloppy claims on the Democratic side about that election being illegitimate, not because of the nature of Donald Trump, but because somehow Russia had stolen the election. That has turned out to be untrue. And so now Republicans think that, there's all of this voter fraud. I'm not saying that these are equivalent moments, but it is important to acknowledge that our democracy has managed to live with a large share of the population thinking that the current president is illegitimate for running up to 20 years now. And we've survived that, and I think we'll survive a bunch of Americans thinking that Joe Biden is legitimate for the next 4 or 8 years as well. That doesn't mean that's great. That doesn't mean that we should be happy about that. But it's important to put it in context.
Michele, briefly.
Yeah, I think we need to start attending to some of the reasons for which people are afraid of the other side winning, which is that they feel like the pie that everybody's supposed to share has gotten smaller. They feel that economic opportunity is, disappearing, work is disappearing. And it's time for elites, in quotes, I think on, both ends of the political spectrum, to start acknowledging that there's shared concerns, shared worries, that if you address them, you can keep people from thinking they can't trust the other side at all. I was trying to get at the idea that people in West Virginia and Ohio, in the Rust Belt, et cetera, have a lot in common with people in urban areas, in South Side of Chicago, where I'm from originally, where work is disappearing. What, as a society, do we do about this? This may be, in fact, a place where the best interventions may not come from government, but may come from things like foundations and think tanks. I know Brookings has been working with, I forget the Stanford folks, I think it's the Hoover Institute. They've been working together on the issue of the disappearance of work. And they've been trying to come up with policy prescriptions and proposals that they need attention outside their group, but it's a bipartisan, transpartisan, if you will, activity. And it may be that for a while we can't count on government, the person worrying about people losing elections and then thinking everything's over. We may not be able to count for a while on our political institutions that are public anyway to do this. We may need to start looking at kind of intermediary civil associations, foundations, think tanks, who want to talk across the borders that divide us. They know our society will not survive if we don't.
We have a few more questions to get through, so I'm going to briefly, Lawrence.
No, go ahead to the questions.
Okay.
Okay, we'll move on. The next question actually kind of speaks a little bit to what you were referring to, Michele, just now. Bill Frenet says, recent articles from The Atlantic and Politico raise the challenge of the Democratic Party between big city versus rural perspectives. It shares how Trump's support from rural areas came in part from how he gave them a voice that was on equal footing with the elites and urbanists. This has led to a negation of experts because it created the feeling of discounting their value. What do you believe could be done to improve the empathy and honest engagement across these demographics?
I mean, Lawrence, do you want to start?
I think this is Michele's question.
Oh, I mean, I don't want to take over on this issue. I think this is so critical. And as I said, some of this, we need forums in unexpected places, in people's neighborhoods, maybe bringing people across neighborhoods or in between them to get together and say, what's the nature of your problem? Your schools aren't funded, ours aren't either. Our kids don't have textbooks that are modern, yours don't either. This is the way in which, and this may not be something government per se can do, the media could do this. You could have a once a week, instead of the 60-minute interview with a single individual, have time for a forum that brings unexpected groups together. I think that's one possibility.
They used to have that in the 1930s during the Great Depression. They would have on the radio, they would get groups together to discuss democracy, the idea, just the very idea of democracy, different groups in different parts of the country. And I think the media played an important role at that point for people to engage in ideas beyond what they might necessarily do. And at this point, I think, the media definitely does not fill that role in the same way. There are editorials written by the worthy people here and others. There are discussions on cable news channels with people with particular points of view, but large good faith discussions about the big ideas of our time, we don't hear as much of at this moment.
And I think it's really important to imagine those conversations in context where people confront people who have different views. There was an amazing project in the fall of last year called the American One Room Project, where they brought representative sample of 600 people together, and they walked them through really critical issues of national politics for this presidential election. And what they saw was an extraordinary movement in people's attitudes on the left and right as they confronted these issues together in a deliberative, respectful forum. And the reality is we don't see that type of movement or that type of understanding regularly anywhere. And I think if we could see it more commonly, if there could be more instances like that where people saw that if I just put myself in a context where I'm not just reading my Facebook news feed, I might come to a different understanding or a capacity for a different understanding that would make Michele's hope, I think, closer to reality.
That's a very good point.
Maybe I'll ask this next question. It's brief, but it's probably the most difficult one. It comes from Arnie Porath, and he asks, given the system of education in our schools, how is it possible to bring the changes that you all are discussing and proposing?
Education is critical. Yascha.
No, I mean, that's a really hard question. I mean, I think there's some things that as somebody who, is an immigrant to this country still shock me. The extent to which, funding for particular schools depends on the particular school district is something that just isn't the case in any other developed democracy in the world. And it's quite clearly unfair and unjust and leads to all kinds of structural injustices. I think there's some ideas which I like, but which I think are really sort of at the margins of, having some kind of year of national service where you might go into different communities. Perhaps you could even think of certain forms of school exchanges before that, not just with other countries, but within America. Why not take a kid from Nebraska and send him to a household in New York and vice versa for a couple of months, the way that happens in Europe from Germany to France or something like that. But in the end, I think it's a matter of just making sure that every person in the United States gets a good high school education. It's striking that American schooling, Americans always think is much worse than in Europe. That's untrue. American public schools at the top end are better than in Europe. And the average is actually pretty good, but you have a huge number of people who are not being served. And by the way, I have some fears about the soft bigotry of low expectations coming back in this political moment for political reasons. So San Diego just abolished its grading system because it found that a lot of African-American students did more poorly than other students in the district. But the problem is not that the African-American students in the district have low grades. The problem is that they come, some of them, obviously not all of them, but some of them, a greater proportion from them, from impoverished households that have suffered intergenerational disadvantage, that go to bad schools. And our grades are a way to be able to actually diagnose the problem, to be aware of that problem. So abolishing grades is not the way to deal with this very fundamental challenge. And I fear that at the moment, there's in some quarters a temptation to look away from the problem rather than do the hard work of actually solving it.
Thank you. I'd like to try to get to one more question here because it brings up a subject that I mentioned in my intro, but I don't think we've touched on yet. Mary Beth Ramey asks, would elimination of the Electoral College help restore credibility and trust in our democratic elections?
So this is something I've been working on a lot. I think that it's first important to recognize if there had been a national popular vote in the last two elections, they would have been completely simple elections to resolve. Instead, because of the Electoral College, we have this incredibly hard-fought battle focused on swing states where tiny numbers of votes can switch the ultimate result. And the other consequence of the Electoral College, the way it is right now, is the only states that matter are these swing states. So literally, it's as if the United States had outsourced the choice of president to another country that isn't even representative of America and said, pick our president for us, because that's what we do. We say to 9 states, you are the only states that matter. 99% of campaign spending is in those 9 states, but those 9 states don't represent America. They're older, they're whiter, their industry is kind of late 19th century, early 20th century industry. It's just a ridiculous way to run the system. The challenge is, how do you get beyond it? So the National Popular Vote Compact is on its way and it could work. So questions about its constitutionality, I think it's constitutional. There's questions about stability, we could argue about those. But it's going to be resisted politically because of this idea that I think it's false, but this idea that it just produces flyover democracy, where the only states that matter are the kind of coasts and the middle part of the country doesn't matter. We should recognize there's another change that doesn't have that problem, which is just allocate electors proportionally at a fractional level. So you can get 1.44 electors depending on your vote in a particular state. Then every state matters. Presidential candidates fight for every vote in every part of the country. And in that system, small states have more power, but it turns out small states are divided evenly between red states and blue states. So it's not a partisan advantage, but it might be something that brings in more buy-in from the Republican side. My view is national popular vote is the right way to go, but my practical reality is that's going to be strongly resisted in a partisan way. And maybe we need to start thinking about solutions that could have a more partisan agreement.
Thoughts from anyone else on that? If not, then let me thank all of you for a fantastic discussion. As predicted, we wouldn't be able to get to everything in 1 hour, but you certainly did an admirable job, I think, in trying to cover so many important topics, and we're really grateful to you for participating. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
And for our members who joined us today, thank you for joining us. We've got a few more things coming in the next few weeks that we'll be announcing for your enjoyment. But in the meantime, we're all very grateful for all of your support as members of the Society of Fellows, supporting the work that the Aspen Institute does all over the country, all over the world. Also, I'd like to wish those of you celebrating Hanukkah a very happy holiday today. And again, thank you for your support of the Society of Fellows, and we look forward to seeing you at the next program. Good night.